Welcome back to another video on my road to 2400. I'm starting to feel very confident about this endeavour, because in that last video I did announce I was halfway there. My classical chess, as you can now see, I'm just about to start playing a match, is 2361. So I'm very nearly 2/3 of the way from 23 to 2400. My rapid rating, which are games that are about 10 minutes, has reached 2367, so I am 2/3 of the way there. And my blitz is still a bit underwhelming, but it is 1/3 of the way at 2333. So things are looking up. Really, in this video, I'm going to try getting my classical rating to 2366 minimum, so that I do indeed manage to get 2/3 of the way there on 2 out of 3 of my ratings. Let's see, what shall I do here? Again, I'm trying to mix it up a little bit with the opening. I think you may get a bit bored if I'm just playing the exact same things over and over again. So I am trying a bit of variety here. It's not the system I play too often, but it's it's not unreasonable. Now, bishop e2. It's a very simple plan. White intends to castle, so I don't really need to go all in on my b5, shove on the queen side yet. I can sort of wait to see how it develops, because I may not want to go on the queen side, depending on how white plans things out. In this kind of check system that I'm doing, with d6 and c6 being played, usually the 2 bishops advantage for white is not a huge advantage in this case, because the centre is going to be fairly closed up. The way I close it, for certain, is to play e5 here. Now, while I do like doing the old Fianchetto plan, I'm not entirely sure it's correct in some of these lines, because it may be too slow. So bishop to e7 might be a slight concession I have to make. It may be the correct move, but it's not entirely suiting me. But it should be reasonable. Then I can put my queen onto any of the diagonal squares it can move to, c7, b6, a5. All of them have different reasons for being quite good. And as you can see, white has already closed up the centre. Now I could play c5 here, but I do like the simple development of pieces. If they take on c6, that's fine, because the e-pawns are still blocked up. Yeah, and they shouldn't really take me. They shouldn't release tension in this case, and I don't think I should either. I think castling is reasonable. The thing is, if I take on d5, they take with the knight. They're always going to want a piece, not a pawn, on d5, so that they are occupying a square in my half with an outpost. And even if I somehow do make them run away, they will later be able to target my d6 pawn by moving their piece off of d5 if necessary, and then rook's on the d file. So I don't really want to have a pawn on d6 with then not having a pawn on d5. But if they take me, then my d pawn isn't so backward, because I can more easily push d5 if I have a pawn on c6 when they trade, if that makes sense. Now, I could go c5 here from c6. That would be somewhat reasonable. I don't really want to do that, though. I'm still trying to use my pieces in this position. Queen c7. Queen b6 obviously is off the table. And queen a5, while I'm sure that's a fairly okay move, I'm not entirely sure if I want my queen there. I don't know how much good it can do on a5. So with c7, I reserve the right to play queen a5 later. I've got the semi-open c-file if I do choose the trading option on d5. I'm also guarding d6 more with the queen and bishop, over protection of the pawn, to make sure there's no tactics there. Also overprotecting c6. And also it's giving me a bit of flexibility, so that I can potentially move my queen somewhere on the king side later. And also knight b6 is now a knight c5. They're kind of easier to play, because there aren't really any tactics when my queen gets trapped on a5. So for me, it's a very reasonable move. Now, white's done queen d2. That does indicate the battery between the queen and bishop on the dark squares. There's not really a lot for it to target, but it does, I guess, cut out the move h6. That could be very, very dangerous if I players and they sacrifice their bishop on h6 for 2 pawns. Let me see, what do I play here? So pawn c5 is like the blocking move, but that is very, very passive. I don't really think my queen side is good enough to justify blocking the centre completely. b5 I don't like because it undermines c6. I can't take back on c6 with a pawn if they do take me. And I do want to have a pawn able to go to c6 at any time. a6 trying to go like c5, b5 feels like a waste of time. So I'm going to make a piece move here. Piece moves are usually good. My knight on d7 is not very good. So knight to b6, it potentially has knight c4 as an idea to get the bishop pair off them. That will remove a lot of white's advantage, and also trade pieces because I am a bit worse on space in general. They've got a pawn in my half and I don't. But also it attacks d5. So what I could also do is take on d5, and they won't be able to end up with a piece on d5 and not a pawn, because if I take on d5 my pawn, they take with their knight. I will take with one of my knights, possibly the f knight, but maybe the b knight. And then they can't take with their queen because they would lose their queen to my other knight. So they'd have to take with their pawn. That would block up the d-file, prevent me from being a lot worse. And then my e-pawn might be able to roll. So perhaps I could, if I do c takes d5, knight takes d5, I'll take with the f knight. They'll take with their pawn. Then I can play f5. And I've got a lot of kingside space. I'm also removing a lot of chance of them attacking on the queen side with knight b6, because with my knight over there, it's hard for them to do much on the queen side as well. Here they probably should take me on c6 to avoid all that stuff. I would take with my pawn. They might go rook a maybe to d1. And again, this knight c4 move is quite good. So potentially like bishop e2 or queen e2 or something after trading on c6. Again, I just like my position. I can go d5 in the future. Might even be able to do it straight away. Yeah, it just generally looks pleasant for black. Time situation is pretty much what you expect in these kind of positions. We're just out of the opening. We're kind of entering the middle game. Both of us have used very little time because we generally know our plans. I've used up about 40 seconds, but with the increment being included, that's what, 11 moves. That's 110 seconds, which is about 2 minutes. So actually I've used up 2 minutes and 40 seconds approximately. Right, b3. That move is, I think, designed to stop knight c4, but I don't see why I can't take on d5 here. I feel like b3 is a error because there's also the fact their knight on c3 is not now protected much, only by their queen. So I do also have a tempo gainer of rook a to c8 in a lot of these positions. Now, they could go knight... Oh, I thought they might have gone knight b5, trying to be tricky, but that looks a bit ridiculous. Or bishop takes knight. But no, they've done knight takes, which is what I expected. Like I broadcast earlier, I am planning the f5 shove. Again, it might not be technically correct if you were to look at a computer, but it just looks very thematic to shove my f-pawn up the board, increase the power of my rook, and even if it isn't correct, I definitely get a loss of play for this. So that's my idea. Shove f5. I'm also kind of threatening f4 or e4, which would restrain their bishops, giving me lots of space. And their queenside play is not usually that useful. My b6 knight is dominated by their b3 pawn. It can't really move forwards, but I can always reroute it via like d7 and then maybe to c5 or f6 in the future. So no problem here. I don't know why they're thinking a long time for this move. There's very little they can do. Pawn takes is pretty much the only move. So let's charge with f5. And because that move is so, to me, so obvious, because it gains lots of space, 2 pawns side by side, e and f, like lovely, they're perfect. I've definitely got more activity for the pieces, especially the rook and the e7 bishop that can now maybe move to f6. I can now pause a bit to think on what to do next. I think pawn moves for white might not be that good, but I do see the argument for playing pawn c4, which would make white's pawn chain go all the way from a2, which would be the base of the chain, the only potentially weak pawn, which is guarded twice, so it's very heavily reinforced, leading from a2 all the way to d5, going into my half of the board. and cramping my pieces a little. And that usually indicates that white has a queenside space advantage, so they could well choose to go on the queen side. There is a kind of unofficial rule that your longest pawn chain, if it's like 3 pawns or more usually, if it's pointing in a certain direction, view it like a big arrow, starting at the base of the chain, and keep pointing it diagonally all the way to the end. So they would be trying to attack on the king side. But they don't really have any pieces in that direction. Okay, now that's the hypotheticals. They've done bishop takes knight. This is an opposite colour bishop ending now. That slightly decreases my chances of winning, so it's maybe a good idea. I am thinking about pawn takes, because it is an interesting move. It increases the power of my rook, and even though it doubles and isolates my pawns, I don't actually know if it's that bad. I am actually going to take with the pawn, because it develops my rook, and they're going to have to play pawn c4 or pawn a4 at a certain time, I think, to try and go on the queen side. And c4 is very useful to control d5. Once they've done that, I can play b5, a bit like in a Slav kind of, where I will trade off my isolated pawns. They've done bishop to e2. This move is designed to stop b5, I believe. So again, increase the power of my pieces. Bishop f6 is what I want to do. And even though my f and e pawns are quite active, I don't really want to push them too much, because if I push one, that weakens the one of the colour of the squares. So if I push e4, that will weaken the dark squares a little. That's probably the move I would do if I had to. And f4 weakens my light squares. And as I have a dark squared bishop, my light squares are already not the best. So e4 might be the only move I would be considering to do with those 2 pawns. But generally they're just very good where they are. They restrain white, they control both white and black squares, all across the king side and centre. And because I don't have an open file on the f file, I don't need my rook there. It looks nice backing up the f pawn. Other than that, it's kind of superfluous. So what I can do is move my f rook to c8. That way I have 2 open files for my rooks. Another reason to do a takes, because it would have taken me several moves to double up my pawns, double up my rooks, and have an open file for both of them. Doubling my pawns has allowed me to open the file, so I have two of them, and my rooks are not being too cramped or having to maneuver a whole lot. Right, let's see. They could go c4 again, but I do have potentially like rook f8, I think. Looks like a reasonable move. I could also go e4. There's also rook to a3 to annoy them, stopping them pushing their pawn up. It does look quite fun, actually. Rook to a3. If they go a4 here, I still have potentially like rook fc8 or e4. And then I have bishop c3 afterwards, which would blockade them, gain space. Be very annoying for white to have to deal with that. Yeah, I quite like that idea, to restrain their pawns. They've done c3. That's a very odd-looking move, because it allows me to attack the c pawn. Very strange. Why are they playing c3? I'm trying to work out. Is it some sort of clever way of gaining a tempo? If I go e4, they go c4 in some future line? So e4, they can't go c4 because I take their rook. They have to go rook a c1. What next? Rook a3, possibly? And then they go like rook c2, rook fa8. I don't really have any attack. Okay, rook a3 isn't working too well. e4 definitely looks good, but rook fc8 also is quite nice, because it definitely is it's not a pawn move, and I didn't really want to move the pawns originally. So rook fc8 still attacks the pawn. It does the same thing as e4, but it gives me the more flexibility. And the rook was going to c8 anyway, so yeah, play the obvious before the optional. Rook's always going to c8. The pawn might go to e4, so make the rook move first. Now, I'm guessing rook ac1. I don't see much else. If rook fc1, I might then be able to play e4. And they can't go c4 because their a1 rook will still be hanging. So I think rook ac1 is almost forced. And with that, it makes their queenside play less palatable because they can't really shove their queenside pawns up as well because their rooks are not both on the queenside. Whereas if rook fc1, both of them would be, but again they can't play it because of e4. My long diagonal is useful. It's almost like I fianchettoed. Even when I didn't in the game, I still found a way to effectively have a dragon bishop on f6. It's hard to know where white's going, really, because their kingside play is not generally going to work here. I've got a piece protecting everything. I can always go g6, guarding my light squares. My queen can shuffle over to f7 if I need to. And I've got the space advantage on the king side. So that doesn't seem to be making a lot of sense. My central play is quite good as well. So attacking in the center is, what you sometimes want to do in middle games, but I don't see how white uses the center very effectively. It's somewhat closed up, and I have that e and f pawn duo, which are controlling lots of squares in white's half. So the queenside play seems to be the only place white has a slight advantage due to my doubled pawns, their bishop pointing over in that direction, and potentially both their rooks and queen having influence on the queen side. I think I'm doing quite a good job, though, of restraining them. And I can always tack, like bring the pieces back over to the king side if I need to, and hold the center quite well. But I'm not sure I can entirely win on the king side alone, the queen side alone. So yeah, it might have to be a joint effort where I keep going back and forth and trying to stretch their defenses. They are down to 10 minutes or so, bit over, about 10 minutes 45. And again, that's not something for them to be horribly concerned with, but psychologically it can mean that they start to somewhat rush because they see I've got nearly double their time. Again, if we all played like automatons, robots, it would not be that big of a factor because they may have needed to use the time, and I haven't, because I feel like I've had sort of better coordination somehow, even though the opening was pretty straightforward. I think maybe I knew what I was doing a bit better, or I knew the plans in the middle game a little better than my opponent, because they seem to have traded that bishop on b6 without full forethought of what comes next. And when you don't know the plans as well, you have to kind of, on the fly, kind of make it up, which is both dangerous and time-consuming. Let's see, what are they going to do? Now, pawn a4, I think if they don't defend the c-pawn, I take it. Bishop c4 is the interesting move. I think I could go and go b5, despite it losing the pawn. And they have gone c4, they've gone for it. Alright, wow. So e4 is definitely the candidate move. b5 is interesting as well. Then they take on b5, and I have stuff like queen to c2. And then I will probably end up taking a2 with equality, but them having a very bad pawn structure. Definitely interesting playing b5. Now, what else could happen? I could go e4 naturally. So they go rook c1. But yeah, I don't really see what I do after rook c1, so I am going to go b5. And this move makes things easy for me. Again, their queen side is slightly improved a little bit because of them gaining space, if you want to look at it that way. But on the other hand, it's made a lot worse because of the fact they're probably going to have doubled isolated b-pawns against my one b-pawn. So even though material would be equal, I'd essentially be a pawn up on the king side. And ideally, I could also play pawn b6 to hold their pawn on b5 and stop them ever attacking b7 with their bishop way in the future. They have done takes. So now let's go queen c2. Essentially, I'm trying to get white to just take me on c2 with the queen. That'll put my rook on the 7th rank, which is normally desirable. Let's see, what else could they do? They could do rook fd1. But I think then possibly I could take their queen, they take back, and I go e4. Then their rook moves somewhere, like rook ad1. And again, I've just got a lot of pressure here. I don't quite see how I win, that's the downside. Yeah, I don't see how I win this, or how I even get an advantage. But it does feel hard for white to play. Perhaps I can win the a-pawn in the future by playing like rook a3 and rook c a8 or something. But Yeah, it's an interesting position. Maybe even... Actually, maybe if rook fd1, just go e4 first. That seems to cut out a lot of complications. Then they go rook ac1 or something, and I can... Can I take the queen? Oh, then they take my rook check. I take back, they take with their rook. I go rook c1 check, rook d1, rook c2, and I win the pawn. And if they go king h2, bishop e5, yeah, okay. That's way too much complications and tactics. But none of that happened. They just played queen takes queen, which makes things very simple. Now bishop d3. I don't think there's much else apart from rook takes pawn because of various tactics. Although I have to think about it for a moment because they are taking on f5. I didn't see that tactic. Perhaps I have made a mistake. Oh dear. Alright. Well, remember I said I was a pawn up on the king's side. So now I won't be, but they won't be a pawn up on the queen's side really, because they have 3 doubled isolated pawns. So potentially I'm not really worse. Now, this bishop's annoying. Where should I go? Rook b2 is pretty safe. Then I go rook c1. e4 just loses the pawn. Alright, I don't want to have any problems on the back rank, so I'm going to play g6. Kick it away, and then I'll reevaluate where to go next. I think I may have made a mistake playing b5 now that I think about it. I didn't see bishop takes f5. Alright, but never mind. I can still try to win this. They're a bit low on time, so again that may play into them not doing so well. It's not easy for their bishop to hold all the pawns. They probably have to go to c4 with the bishop. Okay, they've gone to c8. Well, that seems to be a no-brainer. Probably b6 is best. Don't see... Oh, unless they go rook c1 to c6. Actually, yeah, I do need to think about it for a moment. What else could I do here? Rook to a5. They take me, I take them. They go bishop c6 or something, and I take them. Yeah, actually, rook a5 might be stronger. Because even though I lose the b pawn, I get both their b pawns. So things will be back to equal. We'll both have 4 pawns each. Both of us will have 2 pawn islands. But I'm still somewhat hopeful that I can outplay them in this ending. Let's see. Again, bishop takes pawn is the obvious move. I don't really see what else can be done. Bishop d7 is a kind of safe move, I guess. Rook to c1 potentially is a move, but I think I'm okay. Yeah, bishop d7 makes a lot of sense. Now, where to go next? Pawn b6. I did like it at first, but they just have their rook coming to c6 in that line. So maybe I should find a way to reroute the bishop on f6, because it's my worst piece. Bishop g5, and I don't see where I'm going. I am stopping rook c1, so there is a bonus. I can get a draw with e4, rook a1. So that's something, I guess. My e-pawn might be a bit weak, though, on e4. Alright, let's find the other way round. Bishop d8. What this does is it goes to b6, and then I'm potentially stopping their rook coming to c7 and c6 with tempo. And I'm also hitting f2 by going to b6. And I could also potentially play like bishop c5 to anchor the bishop as well. Okay, they have done rook c1, that was what I was expecting. Now I think bishop b6 is more or less forced, because if rook c8 was the threat, winning my bishop with a pin, so I'm not going to allow that move. Rook c8 check, I don't see what goes wrong here. I just go king g7. There's no way they can do a lot with my weak king, because I've played that g6 move, giving myself a dark square to put my king onto. Bishop e6 check, I think I again go king g7, and there are no checks after that. And maybe I have a little something here, because I have rook a2, which potentially will win the f-pawn, and then I have a passed e-pawn, if I can win the f2 pawn. And things might be better for me there, because even though it would be equal on material, again, their b-pawns are just useless. One of those pawns is basically just a pawn that gets in the way. It doesn't actually have any value, really. Right, what else is there to play? Yeah, bishop c5 and then b6 would completely block the c-file for white and anchor the bishop completely, so that is definitely a candidate move. The line that I'm thinking of them playing, they've played rook c2. I was looking at rook c8 check and then rook b8, which was probably the scariest thing they could do. But then I have rook a1 check, king h2, bishop takes f2, rook takes b7. And I thought that I was maybe a little bit worse, but not like losing. Because they would have passed b pawn, but I can probably win the b3 pawn at the end. But that's all unimportant now because they played rook c2. So bishop to c5 looks quite nice. Yeah, it just looks pleasant, doesn't it? If they go b4 to deflect away my bishop, that's probably the best use of their b pawn. They'll do rook c8, I'll go king g7, they'll go somewhere, rook c7 maybe. Bishop c5, rook takes b7. Yeah, rook a1, king h2, bishop takes f2, and I'm probably a touch better. So let's do this. Bishop to c5. Now, I have to be a little bit careful to prevent rook takes c5, pawn takes, I'm having a passed d-pawn. But even if they do bishop e6 check, king g7, rook takes bishop, pawn takes back, pawn d6, I'm always able to get over in time, like king f6, pawn d7, king e7. A sacrifice of the exchange is not a very good idea in these types of lines, because you need to have enough activity to kind of make up for it. So I don't think that's any good. And blocking the c file like this leaves the only open file that can be used, the a file, which is where my rook is. That way I'm using the kind of three-pronged approach, which is the most important thing, improvement of pieces. So my bishop is now perfect. It's anchored, hitting their f2 pawn, blocking the c file, and potentially has some value on the dark squares. So improvement of pieces with that last move. Develop a plan. So my plan is to go b6, completely anchoring myself. Use the a file, try and win the b pawns or the f2 pawn, stretch their defenses. And finally, prophylaxis. So what I'm doing, a preventative move. So I'm preventing them using the c file for their rook. So I'm devaluing the value of their c2 rook. And also with the idea of b6, I'm making their bishop a bit worse because it has almost no targets in that scenario. It's mostly a defensive piece rather than an attacking piece, whereas my bishop is both. So bishop c5 accomplishes the three main sort of goals you should be looking for in every move in chess. Improvements, planning, and then prophylaxis, in that order of importance. Now, white could just waste time here with a move like g3 and then king g2. But that would allow me to set up b6 and like rook a1 or rook a3, and I try to eventually get my way to a victory. Let's see what they play. Again, I think b4 might be the best option, and they win my b7 pawn, but then I end up probably winning their f2 pawn. So they'll end up with a passed b pawn. I'll have a passed e pawn, probably equal. But I can always anchor my bishop onto d4, where it's very, very centralized. An opposite coloured bishop with a rook ending is not always totally drawn. It's quite funny because the saying is all rook and pawn endings are drawn and the opposite coloured bishops are drawn. So you would think this is like a double draw because of both of them being on the board. But with them together, they kind of cancel each other out, and you can get positions where one side has the initiative. So then the bishop is attacking squares the other bishop can't defend. So it's essentially you being a piece up with the attack. But if either one of those sets of pieces are traded, then it will become extremely drawish. The only way you'd win is having a very active king, which I do intend to have eventually by potentially running my king to f6, then pushing the e-pawn and playing like king to e5 and centralizing the king. And they're still thinking, which is good because that means they're getting very low on their time, down to 3 minutes now. And when they get to 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, then they are entering the blunder zone where anything can happen. It's like a blitz game, and I'm still playing a kind of rapid / classical game. Rook c3 has been chosen. It's a very passive move, rook c3. I'm guessing they're thinking of rook f3 potentially. Now b6 looks very solid. Rook to a1 looks pretty good. King h2 afterwards, and I can take on f2 potentially. I just don't know whether to do that because the b pawn might be weakened. They go rook c8 or bishop e6 or something. I go king g7, whichever one they do. Rook c7 at some point. I'll lose a b pawn. But I've got a more active king in that scenario. No, I'm going to check them. Check them, win the pawn. I'm probably losing the b pawn, but my hope is to get the b3 pawn. So I win back an extra pawn. I basically won an f pawn. Both of us have a passer. My king will be more active on, say, f6. And their king will be a lot less active. I'll have a passed pawn. They'll have one. And I think because my bishop hits b6, it's a lot harder for them to push their pawn to b6, because I would take it with a rook on b3. And also I could be threatening mate with... if my rook was on b3 and their rook's on like b7, I'm threatening bishop g3 check along with their king going back to the first rank and then rook b1 mate. So there's also that little bonus. Now, how are they going to play this? I don't know which one's better, but rook c7 looks a little bit inaccurate because of pawn b6. So I think bishop e6 check is probably best. King g7, rook c7 check. I don't know which way my king goes. h6 is safer. And actually I'd need to guard the h-pawn, so yeah, king h6 is better. And then if bishop g8... Actually, I didn't see bishop g8. I might be losing a pawn. Although maybe I can then start shoving the e-pawn up the board. Like e3, e4, yeah, rook takes, h7, king to g5, rook to e7, pawn e3, and I'm starting to really get the pawn rolling. Now, rook c7 I think is going to be their move, because it makes perfect sense, it activates the rook, and yeah, king h6. Now, bishop g8 is what I'm expecting. Or rook takes b7, one or the other. I don't know whether... Oh, yeah, rook takes b7, yeah. Perfect sense to play that. Now, again, I can't really guard the h-pawn, so I'm going to trade my h-pawn off. There's no way of them guarding the b-pawn. And it still sets up the mate threat. So there are some positives of this. Now they've entered the blunder zone. They're down to under 2 minutes. They could try b6 here, but I think I win the pawn after rook takes b3 and then bishop takes b6. Yeah, bishop takes g8. Sorry, bishop to g8 and then rook takes pawn, so I'm going to do rook takes. Now I'm assuming they're going to do check, because what else can they do? And king g5 is forced. My next move won't be incredibly difficult for me to play. Yeah, king g5. And I am threatening mate in 2 with rook g3. Bishop g3, I mean. And then king moves and rook g1. Rook b1. I can't say squares at the moment, or pieces. Yeah, bishop check and then rook b1 is mate. So again, this is why you sometimes get the initiative with rook and bishop versus rook and bishop of opposite colours. The b pawn's also dropping, so they will have to do something about that. I don't see a way they hold the b pawn and stop the mate. Might be a way, but I don't see what it is. h4 check, I just take with the bishop. If they do rook b7, yeah, they get mated. If they do, let's see, what else can they do? They could do rook f7 potentially, but I think they lose the exchange to bishop g3, king g1, rook b1 check, bishop rook to f1, bishop h2. Oh, but then they have king f2, and they survive. All right, so rook f7 might be a move. g4, wow, okay, so they saw it. They saw they were getting mated if they weren't careful. Now, rook takes b5 is the simple move here. I don't see what else I can play, so that looks easy. Now, as long as I don't somehow get mated with... So I don't know how I would get mated, but my king does have only a couple of squares it can go to. I have to be a little bit careful. What do they do here? King g2, obviously. Bishop somewhere. Anchoring it to d4 looks very, very reasonable. Yeah, just anchor it. Anchor the bishop. So it will never get taken, hopefully, with that pawn guarding it. I maybe should have anchored it on c5, because I am going to push my e-pawn in the moment. Yeah, time to push. I'm not getting mated, because h4 check, I have king f4. And I could run my king to potentially d2 and then start pushing. Yeah, h4, king to f4. They can check me if they really want to, but king e3 looks pretty effective. Could even play rook b2 and try and trade off, but I don't really want to do that with opposite bishops unless I'm certain I'm winning. Yeah, and run my king upwards. King e5 is like a safety move. I don't want to go king e5. It looks too kind of against general principles. King is a fighting piece. I'm essentially promoting my king to say like d1 or d2 or somewhere, and then push my e-pawn. Rook f1, yeah, okay. Now rook b2 is a way to kind of improve my rook, because I can have rook on the 7th. It also deflects their king away from having squares near me. You know, there's f3, f2 that are all being reinforced by the king and rook. So I'm making the king less active. And I do potentially have a mate if king g3. There's also that plan. So I've got moves like bishop to e5 and rook h2 mate, if they're not careful. They've done king g1. Now, king to e2 or king to d2. I want to give my king more, more abilities here. So king d2, what that does is it's a check, but it also allows my pawn to now shove up the board, and my king has the duty of guarding the pawn. So king somewhere, doesn't matter where they go. Yeah, king g2 for example. Time to push. Keep pushing the pawn. That's a monstrous passed pawn. Very difficult to stop. They might have some sort of g5 and then something, but no, they've moved the king. So can I not just push? I don't see why not. Keep pushing. And I think I'm winning now because I'm going to play e8, e1 queen. And I'm going to be completely winning. Because I'll be a rook up. That should be enough, right? I need to be just a tiny bit careful, like don't allow them to push their pawns too much and, you know, get a pawn on the 7th or something. But other than that, I should win. Funnily enough, rook h1, pawn queen, and then rook h2. Check would skewer me, but my rook's guarded by the bishop, and king can get back anyway. So there's no weird move they can do. All right. I was hoping to get to 23.66, but I seem to have only gained 2 points. That's a bit annoying. I have to play another game. Just a little bit annoying there. All right, I got a 2100. Okay, no matter what, I will do knight f6 to pre-move. Alright, we have got an English opening. And do I want to do a reverse Sicilian? I think I've done a few of those already in previous videos. I'm trying to think of openings that I haven't done. Let me think for a moment. I've done like c5, haven't I? I've done the English symmetrical. Pawn c6, maybe, leading to a kind of Slav type position. Let's try the Slav. And I actually don't like playing this as white because I'm always scared that black will take on c4, and I don't really know quite enough theory to back up my positions. I do know enough that I can usually win back the pawn or get some sort of initiative, but usually for the first like 20 moves, I am a bit uncomfortable in those types of situations. Yeah, bishop g2. It's not the move I do. I normally go knight f3 at move 3. But it can often transpose into each other. Now c6 is essentially a move which guarantees that black is going to go d5. And white can play d4 here, but which is a slight variation of the Slav, because normally white's already moved out a knight in regular Slav. They haven't done a direct fianchetto. I'm not sure if that makes a huge difference, though, because they could probably transpose into something, but possibly it gives me a few more options, like e5 potentially. Now knight f3 is the move in these situations. And if I go like bishop f5, I usually end up playing e6 and then having my bishop pair ruined with knight h4. So that, even though it's a more active way of playing the Slav, I have started to become a bit more apprehensive. So I normally do either bishop f5 then h6 in order to preserve my bishop, which I believe Carlsen did in the tournaments just finished, the Chess Legends. He played a game where it went d4, knight f3, h3, and then he went bishop to f4 in order to have h2 as a safety square for the bishop. Now, what else could white do? They could do the exchange Slav, pawn takes pawn. I'll take back with my c6 pawn, and I seem to have come out of things fairly well. Knight c3 is a move. I'll probably take on c4, because if it's the move that worries me, I should therefore be playing it and having a good position, right? It's odd they're spending this amount of time on a move. It's either they know that bishop g2 is a slight inaccuracy and they're now trying to find a way to solve that problem, or they just haven't expected me to do a Slav. No, they've taken me. Alright, so it could still be that. Now take with the pawn, very simple move. You can take with the knight, but I do like giving c6 up for my knight to move to. So we're in essentially the exchange Slav with white doing a fianchetto. I'm not totally sure if the fianchetto is a good idea. Now, bishop f5. Queen b3 is an option, but I generally don't like it that much. And I have to work out... Yeah, I think I can do it. Pawn e6. If knight to h4, I have bishop e4, which is annoying. They have immediately done knight h4. So bishop to e4. And wow, they've done f3. That is a very, very suspicious move. And it might be correct, but it looks very bizarre. I didn't expect that move at all. Alright, gain a tempo. take their knight and make their rook look silly. Now queen b6 could be nice. I could do b6, going for tricks. There's no reason to do that. Queen a5 is also quite pleasant. Bishop e7 is quite good. Yeah, let's go queen b6. Queen b6 at least has a sort of small threat to it, at least. It has the pawn on d4 being attacked. They should probably do bishop to e3. Pawn to e3 just looks very, very weakening here. Again, it might be enough, but it seems odd to play this way. And white does have some issues, and I might even, after bishop e3 actually, I might be able to play g5 in some of these lines. Not yet, but very soon. Maybe bishop e7 first, and if they do something silly like a3, I might actually have g5. Then bishop takes g5 and knight takes d4. But I guess then they have bishop back to e3, and I'm not really guessing a lot for it. Maybe I should forget that idea. Right, what could white be thinking of here? I think the two moves to consider are e3 and bishop e3. So putting something on e3 anyway. Now, if bishop e3, I do have the move like pawn to e5 if I really want to. But it just feels a bit loosening because I'm destroying my pawn chain, f to G or f to d, and my king is still in the center, so opening up the center might not be the best plan because they can just play a simple move like bishop to f2, and while I do win a pawn, I'm definitely helping white in that position, and also allowing moves like knight to f5. So yeah, I don't like e5 yet. I think bishop to e6 or perfect slip there. Bishop to e7 or d6 are the two candidates that I have because both allow me to castle. I'm not totally sure which one is stronger, but bishop e7 is a nice flexible move. So that looks quite nice. Then they do something or other and I castle. I have the open C file for my rooks. They're still considering what to do. So another reason that I would suggest anyone listening try out either new openings that you haven't done before or openings that you used to play but maybe gave them up. Not saying you should play them all the time, but try and have like 4 or 5 openings you can do because you'd be amazed at how many times the position goes from one type of position to another. And if you know all the ideas in like pretty much every opening, you'll almost never be without a plan. There'll be some kind of structure that's reminiscent of another line if you're in trouble, and that way you can use the same plans you would use in that opening. You can then use them in this one. They played King H1. That's not a move I expected at all, King H1. Alright, well, Smyslov rule, when you're ahead, take things. Queen takes. I'm trying to use the Smyslov rule, which is to capture a pawn if you can, and also the other idea, the Dolmatov rule, after a very, very strong grandmaster, which is essentially he likes endings, so try and get to an ending by trading lots of pieces when you're ahead, which are kind of already quite well known in general principles, but I like assigning like a name to it or some sort of good, an easy way to remember it with some sort of memory technique, by giving it a name or thinking of something whenever I do it, so that I never forget, essentially. So certain concepts I like being able to put a name to them, like the mate. If their rook on f1 somehow went to g1 and my knight on f6 went to f2, instead of calling it like the knight f2 mate, smothered mate is the name that kind of covers all knight checkmates in that theme. So you can, by knowing the name, it allows you to broaden your horizons and think in terms of concepts. It's almost the opposite of 1984's Newspeak, where the idea there was to limit the language, limit the phraseology, and that way it would limit thought. So I'm trying to advocate expanding thought by having different names and phrases and concepts, so that you can improve chess. Let's see, I mean, queen takes queen to me is totally wrong, because it trades a piece when you're down. Why would white do that? They do have the bishop pair, so that is arguably worth half a pawn, but it's not worth a full pawn. Yeah, queen c2, definitely a reasonable move. Just like earlier, I said bishop e7, very flexible. I need to castle, the centre could open extremely quickly. Rook d1, yeah, absolutely. Now I could go queen c5, that looks pretty reasonable. So again, I'm offering the trade of queens. I want the trade, because it would allow me to go into a position where I'm winning in the ending. Again, I think white should refuse the trade. Queen b3 to me looks simple. And I think I might actually have castling to set a trap. If queen b3, I castle. They play queen takes b7. And I thought I might be able to trap the queen and rook a b8. Maybe I don't. Yeah, maybe I don't quite do it. Never mind. Shame, really. Alright, but they've done queen a4, just not important then. Queen to a4. Alright, what next? I think castling is, again, the move that is necessary in this position. Connecting my rooks, improving the position, getting my king safe. I'm prepared to double on the c-file if I need to. Also, quite nice, if their queen went to, say, a3 or something, I have queen c2 forking the two rooks. Alright, they're trying to open the centre, like I said, and I think Dolmatov rule, just try and trade off stuff. Normally you shouldn't trade all the pawns off, but I like opening up the d-file here, which will allow me to trade rooks. Now they have to take me, there's no other move. And then I have rook fd, oh, or, again, what did I say earlier? Smothered checkmate, I've got knight g4. See, there we go, knight g4 coming, and there's the concept of, let's say pawn takes pawn, knight g4, they do, I don't know, knight f3. Then I go knight f2 check, king g1, knight h3 double check, and then king to h1, queen to g1 check, kiss of death. They have to take with either their f3 knight or their d1 rook, doesn't matter which one. And then my knight on h3 can go to f2 with a smothered checkmate. There we go. So with that just little concept of smothered mate on f2 if their rook was on g1, the whole tactical sequence just flows easily. And they have played bishop g5. Now, can I go knight g4 anyway to win the bishop pair? Probably not, but it looks interesting. Actually, can't I just take it? Okay, me being an idiot, Smyslov rule. Take it if you can't see why not. There I was trying to be clever with knight g4. I can just take a free bishop. I think they could resign now. And hopefully I gain at least 3 points, and that would put me over to 23.66. Perfect, wonderful. No, I won't rematch. I will quickly analyse the game because it was, at least to me, interesting. I like to analyse the final game of a video. So I can't analyse them all, it would last too long. And let's have a look. So it's still analysing. It won't take very long to do the analysis. If you haven't watched a video before, it takes about a minute at most. I made no inaccuracies at the very end, at least, but to be fair, my last couple of moves were not exactly difficult. Yeah, I made one inaccuracy already. I might make another one or two. Okay, looks like I played quite well. Wow, I did play very well there. Let's see. So I'm playing theory, essentially, at move, sort of first 5 moves or so, playing an exchange Slav. Again, I think knight f3 is the more common move for white's third move, because it gives you the option of bishop g2 anyway, but it also controls the e5 and d4 squares, which might be important for controlling the center early in the game. Anyway, it wasn't that important because we sort of transposed where white was low on options. I had lots of things to do. Yeah, bishop f5 was pretty solid. Castles and e6 is very common. And I was going to go h6 next move, if they did like knight c3. And then h6 would stop bishop g5, but also it would give luft for my king for way in the future, if I was back rank checkmated. But at the same time, the most important immediate reason is to then play bishop h7 if knight to h4 was to be played. Now, bishop e4 was my move here when they attacked me. I wanted to trade off their light squared bishop for mine, leave them with lots of weaknesses on the light squares near their king. And f3 surprised me. I thought they were going to go knight f3 if they didn't take. So I need to gain a tempo with this, activate my pieces, and then they just sort of gave me a pawn. So my play was not exactly difficult here. Queen takes d4, simple. Queen c2. Queen c2 I think is probably their best chance. Bishop e7, yeah, it looks like a good move. Rook d1. Okay, so apparently queen c5 is inaccurate, queen b6 is better. But to me, offering the trade is just a much easier way of playing. So, alright, I made a slight error with that move. Queen to a4. Alright, apparently I should trade queens and throw general principles out the window. Castles. e4 looked odd, so again, open up the game when you're ahead, take. And then, yeah, just blunder. So capture, nice and easy. And game over. So nice win. I'm at now 23.67, identical to my rapid play rating. So 2 ratings at 23.67. And now that I've made it 2/3 of the way there on those 2 ratings, I will probably now devote some of my time to playing Blitz, trying to get up to at least 23.50 before I do any more videos on Classic or Rapid Chess. I'm going to try and get all my ratings up to 2400 together. I don't really want to do one at a time. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. Hope you got something from it or found it entertaining. And see you next time. Bye.